I'm Mark Mallet, and you're listening to The Now Word. Well, if there was any doubt that Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada is a globalist at heart, that should have vanished with today's announcement of King Charles to deliver the throne speech. To the casual observer, this may appear a non-issue, a mere formality. But when you understand the mutual stated goals of both Carney and King Charles, this invitation is more of a harbinger that the Great Reset is advancing on Canadian shores quickly. Well, perhaps Carney summed up his invitation to King Charles best when he said, "This is an historic honor which matches the weight of our times." Well, what weight is that? Trump's nationalism and tariffs? Well, perhaps, in part. But for Carney, the iron rod that needs to be wielded is the exact same one that King Charles revealed at the start of the so-called pandemic. Back in September 2020, when he was still a prince, he said, "Without swift and immediate action at an unprecedented pace and scale, we will miss the window of opportunity to reset for a more sustainable and inclusive future. We must put ourselves on what can only be described as a warlike footing." Well, like other globalists, Charles and Carney were waiting for that window of opportunity to impose what the World Economic Forum calls a great reset of the global economy through the levers of climate change and pandemics. In the words of globalist George Soros, he said in May 2020, "This is the crisis of my lifetime. Even before the pandemic hit, I realized that we were in a revolutionary moment where what would be impossible or even inconceivable in normal times had become not only possible, but probably absolutely necessary. We must find a way to cooperate on fighting climate change and the novel coronavirus." Well, all of this sounds benign, maybe even noble, until you lift the hood and carefully examine the economic engine that these globalists are proposing. It's nothing short of a neocommunist worldview that blends capitalism and Marxism. As Ottmar Edenhofer of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change unambiguously declared, "One must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. Obviously, the owners of coal and oil will not be enthusiastic about this. One has to free oneself from the illusion that the international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." Oh, really? Well, this so-called redistribution of wealth is only possible if the general public is assured that the world is facing an apocalyptic climate doomsday, as Greta Thunberg has told us is imminent. In his review of Mark Carney's book, Values, Building a Better World for All, Dr. Jordan Peterson concludes that for Carney, this means that preserving the planet is his primary value and the North Star that must guide all, and he means all, personal and economic decision-making. This also means, take note please, that he's willing to and even must use fear as a shaper of policy, the very fear of impending cataclysmic emergency that has always been capitalized on by even the most explicitly reluctant of tyrants to ensure that their hypothetically benevolent dictates are applied absolutely everywhere and now. Well, in Carney's own words at the COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, he said, "Our goal has been to put in place the information, tools, and markets so that every financial decision takes climate change into account." You caught that? Every financial decision. And this, he said, is to create a financial system in which a company's contributions to climate change and climate solution are fundamental determinants of its value. Firms that align their business models with the transition to a net zero carbon economy will be rewarded handsomely, and those that fail to adapt will cease to exist. Well, there you have it. At the COP26 gathering there in Scotland, where Mark Carney was the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, King Charles, again when he was still a prince, said, "Here we need a vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector." Well, apparently it's a military-style campaign to eliminate those businesses who don't comply. Thus, for Carney, this intrinsically means abandoning fossil fuels in order to reach a supposedly critical target of reducing planetary mean temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, a goal that the late Pope Francis curiously promoted while at the same time saying that the church is no place to resolve scientific questions. He said in 2019, "Dear friends, time is running out. A carbon pricing policy is essential if humanity wants to use the resources of creation wisely. The effects on the climate will be catastrophic if we exceed the 1.5 degree threshold outlined in the Paris Agreement goals." Again, that was Pope Francis. Well, on the contrary, numerous studies are showing that the planet is actually greening and becoming more fertile as a result. A peer-reviewed study published in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation underscored that global greening is an indisputable fact and has accelerated over the past 20 years across over 55% of the globe. And then, thus says Carl Burke in a Norwegian study that was similar in its results, he said it's ironic that the very same carbon emissions responsible for harmful changes to climate are also fertilizing planet growth, which in turn is somewhat moderating global warming. Well, yeah, science shows that more carbon dioxide increases vitamins and mineral output in plants as well as their medicinal properties. As such, over 1,600 researchers, including Nobel laureates Ivar Geiranger and of Norway and Dr. John Clauser, signed a declaration stating, I quote, "There's no climate emergency." Nonetheless, Charles and Carney do not intend to let this window of opportunity close on their messianic goals, which includes dismantling the oil industry. Said Mark Carney in his book, "To meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, more than 80% of current fossil fuel reserves, including 3/4 of coal, half of gas, 1/3 of oil, would need to stay in the ground, stranding these assets." Well, this is not only delusional, it's dangerous. Former Greenpeace co-founder Dr. Patrick Moore warned, "We do not have any scientific proof that we are the cause of the global warming that has occurred in the last 200 years. The alarmism is driving us through scare tactics to adopt energy policies that are going to create a huge amount of energy poverty among the poor people. It's not good for people, and it's not good for the environment. In a warmer world, we can produce more food." And as I just quoted, showing you these peer-reviewed studies are showing just that. Well, aside from Carney's threats to virtually annihilate industry that does not comply with the World Economic Forum's climate hysteria, there are already draconian plans unfolding through movements such as the C40s initiative. Among their goals, there must be an average 28% reduction in the number of flights across C40 cities. They want to eliminate the need for car ownership. So there goes your freedom to travel, my friends. They're calling for a radical decrease in the availability of meat and dairy and a move to a plant-based diet. Maybe an insect-based diet. After all, in Canada here, the government invested $8.5 million into an insect protein processing plant that's gone online that is for both human and pet food products. And finally, they also are calling in these C40 cities that consumers can only purchase 3 new clothing items per year. As journalist Peter Foster concludes, Carney's climate plan is much closer to the notion of Soviet central long-term planning. What Carney ultimately wants is a technocratic dictatorship justified by climate alarmism. Well, this is neocommunism, or what is otherwise known as ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards. This is throughout Mark Carney's book. Says Foster, ESG is the child of 2 subversive doctrines that have been around since before the collapse of communism: corporate social responsibility and sustainability. As with communism, the ESG movement's aspirations are for global control. Well, in this technocratic vision of the World Economic Forum, whose board Carney sat on and advised, their ultimate vision is a world where you will own nothing and be happy, as their promotional video mused, as you might recall. Of course, the abdication of the right to private property is central to the Marxist communist worldview. But there's another more ominous reality coming into view in the globalist vision, and that is what to do with the surplus population of laborers, perhaps in the billions, whose jobs will have been lost through the destruction of the fossil fuel industry, the closing of industries who emit too many carbons, the automation of labor through robotics, and the advent of artificial intelligence. In a video done by Prince Charles, where he essentially launches the global Great Reset campaign, there's an eerie moment when he says, "We simply cannot waste any more time. The only limit is our willingness to act." Then we suddenly see depopulated, silent streets and cities. The video concludes then with Charles saying, "And the time to act is now." Well, you can draw whatever conclusions you want, but Pope John Paul II has actually said the quiet part out loud. In his document Evangelium Vitae, he said, "With time, the threats against life have not grown weaker. They are taking on vast proportions. They are not only threats coming from the outside, from the forces of nature or the Cains who kill the Abels. No, they are scientifically and systematically programmed threats. We are in fact faced by an objective conspiracy against life, involving even international institutions." Well, the 2 levers of global control, according to the World Economic Forum and their founder Klaus Schwab, are climate change and COVID-19. The latter involved the injection of billions with an mRNA gene therapy that to date has injured and claimed the lives of millions. That's just the facts that we've seen in numerous studies and the government's own data, a fact that the media continues to cover up or ignore. Thus said John Paul II, nor can it be denied that the mass media are often implicated in this conspiracy. Absolutely. Well, the goal of this podcast right now is not to frighten, but to awaken the listener and to call us to act accordingly. As Pope Benedict XVI said, we must not underestimate the disturbing scenarios that threaten our future, or the powerful new instruments that the culture of death has at its disposal. Look, we have to be realistic right now. In the heavenly vision of St. John the Apostle of the final times of our era, he saw a woman clothed in the sun, facing a dragon who stood ready to consume her unborn child. Said Pope John Paul II, this struggle parallels the apocalyptic combat described in Revelation 11 and 12. Death battles against life. A culture of death seeks to impose itself on our desire to live and live to the full. It is therefore also to this woman that the Church turns to intercede for us in this hour. especially through the rosary. As Our Lady of Fatima called us in May 13th, 1917, she said, "Pray the rosary every day in order to obtain peace for the world and the end of war." At that time it was World War I, but it certainly applies to the wars of our times. As Scripture itself says in Genesis 3:15 and Luke 10:19, it's to her and to us, her spiritual children, that is given the authority to tread upon serpents and scorpions and upon the full force of the enemy, Jesus said. Hence, the task that faces each of us now is to be both witnesses and intercessors in these times, in what St. Paul called in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine like lights in the world. It's our role to remind the world through both word and action that our dignity and value is not measured by our carbon footprint, but by the fact that we are made in the image of God. At the end of Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II said, "There can be no true democracy without a recognition of every person's dignity and with respect for his or her rights. Nor can there be true peace unless life is defended and promoted. As Paul VI pointed out, every crime against life is an attack on peace, especially if it strikes at the moral conduct of people. But where human rights are truly professed and publicly recognized and defended, peace becomes the joyful and operative climate of life in society." Yes, that's the climate change that is so desperately needed.